Can you guys see that okay?
Yep.
Excellent. Right, nice to meet everyone. I'm Michael Nuth. I'm a social scientist at BRANZ. I work alongside Kazimar and Oren. I'm presenting on a project that I'm 3/4 of the way through at the moment, earthquake-prone public buildings, balancing life safety risk and community costs. It is a joint project with a number of researchers from different organisations. We have Professor John Hopkins from the School of Law at the University of Canterbury, who specialises in disaster law. We also have an engineer, Dave Brunson, from the Kestrel Group. We have Emma Hudson-Doyle, who's from the Joint Centre of Disaster Research at Massey University. And we have a number of people at resilient organisations based in Christchurch, Dr. Charlotte Brown being one of them as well. So this is a joint project which I'm leading, and it's been funded by BRANZ. In terms of the problem that we're seeking to address with this, the project is really focused on how local authorities make decisions about earthquake-prone public buildings. For example, libraries and pools and so on. When the precautionary closure of such public assets can also cause immediate social and economic risks for communities. So, you know, depending on where you are in the country, I'm sure some of you would have encountered cases like this before. In Wellington, we have the public library that was closed because of concern about earthquake risk. There are probably numerous examples in Christchurch, right through the country, and I'll talk about one in a minute, which is a bit closer to home with where I live. But there have been cases in the media quite frequently about particular buildings that contain public services, being libraries or something else, which have been closed for precautionary measures because they've been deemed to be earthquake prone. As I'll explain in a moment, earthquake prone doesn't actually mean dangerous, and there's actually no incentive or need under the Building Act for local authorities to actually close these buildings immediately. But that's something I'll fish out. One of the challenges facing local authorities in New Zealand is that the closure of public buildings categorised as earthquake prone can have negative socioeconomic effects on communities. In the attempt to keep the public and council staff safe, local authorities must contend when they close these buildings with the paradox that the efforts to avoid seismic risk may exacerbate other risks, such as social isolation and also a localised economic downturn in cases where a library or a pool or some other public asset brings in business to a local area. So within this project, we're interested in how these risks are weighed up by local authorities and also by what process. Although the Building Act has timeframes for how soon earthquake-prone public buildings must be remediated, 7.5 years for high priority buildings and high seismic risk zones, for example. Many local authorities are closing their buildings immediately as soon as they get the engineer's assessment, which is negatively impacting communities. So we sought in this project to understand why some councils are actually making these decisions rather than taking the time to actually make a decision about how they're going to go about the work and whether or not they can actually mitigate the risk while keeping the building open for use. Ultimately, the study is interested in how local authorities rationalise decisions about seismic risk within a geographical timescale. So sure, we have earthquakes in New Zealand, but when we talk about geographical timescales, it's over thousands of years. So when we say an earthquake, a building is earthquake prone, then it may be vulnerable in an earthquake that may happen within a continuum of, say, 5,000 years, for example. So how they rationalise decisions about that versus the immediate socioeconomic consequences of closing public buildings categorised as earthquake prone. And during our initial scoping of the topic, it became clear that some local authorities' decisions to close earthquake-prone public buildings are based solely on an engineer's seismic assessment. So the engineers tell them, oh, we think this building is prone, seismically prone, so therefore the council will go closing it down. But it was also clear in our initial scoping that while some local authorities have robust policies about managing different forms of risk, seismic risk and community risk, it appears that others in New Zealand do not, and make decisions to quickly close public buildings based upon the view that building categorized as earthquake prone is necessarily unsafe. And again, I will explain later on that that's not necessarily the case. So this presents a challenge to local authorities because an engineer's percentage NBS rating, and for those who are not familiar with that term, NBS means new building standard. So when a building is categorized as earthquake prone, it's typically assessed as being under 34% NBS of the new building standard. So that's the kind of legal threshold for a building to be deemed earthquake prone. And when it is deemed earthquake prone, the expectation under the Building Act is that over a certain number of years, depending on the building and where it's located in New Zealand, that it will be remediated or knocked down. Percentage NBS rating does not represent an absolute assessment of risk, and a rating of less than 34% NBS, which is that legal threshold I mentioned before, does not mean that a building is expected to collapse in moderate levels of earthquake shaking. And this nuance is not commonly understood, and it's not commonly understood amongst decision makers at the level of local government throughout New Zealand. Percentage NBS is more or less a proxy for a full risk assessment. It is not a predictor of how a building will seismically behave. So recognising these issues, the premise of this research is to understand how the direct socioeconomic impacts of public building closure are being balanced or could be better balanced against the possible physical and human impacts of an earthquake in a way that can be publicly communicated. And the central aim of the study is to co-develop a risk management framework with councils that supports local authorities to navigate decisions about earthquake-prone public buildings in a way that accounts for a variety of impacts beyond those solely associated with seismic risk, while remaining consistent with the legislation. Right, so this pool here is Nainai Olympic Pool. I live in Nainai, it's in Lower Hutt. Nainai is a lower socioeconomic area of Lower Hutt, Greater Wellington area, high deprivation. This pool is located within a shopping area which has economically struggled over the years, but it's been kept afloat by this pool being open because it brings a lot of business, right? A lot of foot traffic, not just from people from the local community, but also from other communities, other suburbs, and also outside of Lower Hutt as well. About 2 or 3 years ago, it was assessed as earthquake prone. And as soon as it was given that assessment, the local council shut it down immediately. And that had immediate effects within the local community. For a number of reasons. One, the local businesses really relied on it, and a number of businesses closed because this pool was shut down. And we're already talking about a high deprivation area as well, so it really caused a lot of problems. The other side of things is social contact. This pool had a number of community groups that met there. These were groups for the disabled, for young people, a wide range of older people as well. And the loss of the pool meant that they lost their regular social contact also. So this just demonstrates that these decisions, and sometimes there are appropriate decisions, and don't get me wrong, but if they're made in a knee-jerk way, without considering what are the mitigations for people who may rely on that particular the services within their building, that they can have fairly dramatic impacts on people in the community. Before I get into the nuts and bolts of this presentation, I thought I'd just give a bit of an overview about me and my background. So I did an MA in sociology at the University of Canterbury, finishing in 2007 with a focus on the sociology of risk. My supervisors at the time were Professor David Thorns and Colin Goodridge. I imagine they're long retired now. So I was focused on the sociology of risk and specifically on the global risks, the potential effects of global risks on New Zealand tourism. And I included within that a look at what a global pandemic would do to New Zealand tourism. So it's funny all these years later to see that a pandemic has hit and has affected us. Kind of seems that everything that I kind of suggested had come to pass. Then I moved into policy. So I moved into a role after university as a Housing Policy Advisor at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, and that commenced my career within the building and construction industry, studying from a policy perspective. After a few years of being a policy advisor, I got quickly disillusioned with policy and sick of shuffling paper and being in front of a computer all day. So I retrained, and I did something entirely different and retrained as a construction project manager. I went from being an academic, a policy advisor, to effectively employing builders and designers and architects and being on site and managing that process. It was very different from being an academic and being a policy advisor, but I loved it. And a lot of the projects that I worked on and managed were seismic retrofits, mainly for commercial clients. So I've seen a lot of these issues up front around earthquake-prone buildings and how they're managed. I've got first-hand experience of it. So presently I'm a social scientist within BRANZ, and my main interest is how technical advice translates into public policy decisions. So in this example with earthquake-prone buildings, engineering advice, technical engineering advice gets translated into public policy decisions in the process of doing so. Right, so in terms of research objectives. So as a preamble here, while risk is a subjective concept, strong risk literacy and structured processes for interpreting risk information are important for a robust risk assessment. Without a robust process, some local authorities may be inadvertently and inappropriately allocating resources or making decisions and adversely impacting the communities. Therefore, the aim of this project is to develop a comprehensive risk identification and decision-making framework that supports local authorities to navigate decisions about earthquake-prone public buildings and accounts for a variety of impacts beyond those solely associated with seismicity. It is also intended that this decision support tool will help provide a clear rationale for the management of earthquake-prone public buildings that can be easily communicated to the public. It's one thing to make a decision, it's another thing to be able to communicate and defend a rationale to the public. And these can be very political decisions, and it can upset a lot of people. So it's really important that you are very clear in your communication about how you came to that decision about whether to keep a building open or to close it, and there's risks either which way. But in terms of the three main project objectives here, one is to investigate the key drivers leading local authorities to make decisions about earthquake-prone public buildings. So why do they sometimes close them? Why do they sometimes keep them open? And to understand how earthquake-prone engineering risk information is interpreted, evaluated, and acted upon by territorial authorities, keeping in mind that a lot of these decision makers are not engineers, they're not people with technical backgrounds. So how do they take this information from engineers about seismic risk and then turn that into decisions about what they do, which affects the community? And thirdly, as I mentioned before, to identify and develop tools, resources, and processes for public authorities to confidently and transparently make earthquake-prone public building decisions. So it's quite a big project, and we've given ourselves a year to do it, but I'll take you through it now. So in terms of our method, so this is a multidisciplinary approach to the topic, right? So within our research team, we have a professor of disaster law, that's Professor John Hopkins from University of Canterbury, very senior consultant engineers as well, Dave Brunson, who's a consultant to MB. We have risk management experts, Charlotte Brown and Richard Ball from Resilient Organisations, and disaster research expertise, that's Hudson Doyle from Massey University. So taking a multidisciplinary approach to this topic. One of the first things that we did was to get a really good understanding of the relevant legislation guiding local authorities on this topic, and that's where Professor John Hopkins came in and did a thorough review of the Building Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and the Local Government Act, and understanding what the responsibilities for local government is through those pieces of legislation. We've also conducted several interviews with the building owner and regulatory arms of councils across New Zealand on their risk management policies when it comes to earthquake-prone public buildings that they own. Based on these interviews, we have, as a team, developed a risk identification and management framework representing what we think might be best practice for taking parts of what everyone has said to us from these local authorities. And just recently, actually last week, we've been workshopping that with local authorities to get their feedback on whether what we think is best practice, a best practice model, would actually work within a New Zealand context. So it's a bit of an iterative process, and it's a process of co-development as well, because we're not just a bunch of academics coming in, making, throwing around ideas about how risk should be identified and managed. We're trying to do it in a way which is collaborative with local authorities also. Right, so just to get into a little bit of detail here about the legal context in New Zealand, the Building Act, Health and Safety at Work Act, and the Local Government Act. So the first thing to say is that the the legal framework for earthquake-prone buildings in New Zealand is multi-level and multifaceted. Some people might even say it's confusing. In terms of seismic resilience, the focus tends to be on the Building Act and its various earthquake-prone building amendments. But this is only one part of the legal landscape in New Zealand, particularly for local authorities. The complexity for local authorities is due to their dual roles as both building owners, but also as regulators. This means that, as well as their role in regulating the Building Act and its earthquake amendments, local authorities are also subject to the requirements of the Health and Safety at Work Act. A key feature of the Health and Safety at Work Act is that building owners, such as councils, have a legal liability as a person conducting a business or undertaking, or a PCBU, that's a legal term, and perhaps more importantly, a clear social responsibility for ensuring the health and safety of building occupants and users. In this context, the duty of the PCBU, that's the person conducting a business or undertaking, is broad and requires PCBUs to protect the health and safety of workers and others using the building, and to provide an environment where risks to health and safety are carefully managed to the extent that this is reasonably practical.
Sorry to interrupt, Michael. Probably just got 3 or 4 minutes left.
Oh, really? Oh, geez. Okay, I'll motor through it then. I wasn't sure how long this was going to take. Okay, so under the health and safety legislation, the PCBU is personally liable. Okay, so in the aftermath of a seismic event, for example, prosecutions under the legislation could be possible, and should a PCBU be convicted for failing to comply with their duty, the consequences are personal and serious and could include imprisonment. So accordingly, under the health and safety legislation, there exists strong incentives for councils to take a cautious approach to the management of public buildings categorised as earthquake-prone. At the same time, however, there is a tension because local authorities are subject to the specific requirements around the provision of services found in the Local Government Act and rules around decision-making which apply to all public bodies. So in particular, in accordance with the Local Government Act, local authorities must consider the interests of both current and future communities and take that into account when making decisions. Such interests would obviously need to include the seismic resilience of such assets, but also potentially the impacts of closing such assets for current and future communities on economic and cultural well-being. This would suggest that the management of seismic risk in public buildings must be made in the context of economic and cultural interests. If a territorial authority determines through relevant evidence and assessment that a public building poses too great a risk to safety to remain open, the legal framework appears to require that they must also consider how to mitigate the economic and cultural impacts of such a closure and support persons or communities directly impacted. So this creates a complex environment for local authorities to work in when it comes to seismic resilience, which must be understood in the social context within which local government operates. Okay, so I realise I don't have much time. Just last couple of slides, in which case. So look, we are 3/4 of the way through this. We've basically done all of our field work. And we are consulting now with local authorities on what we call a strawman model, a draft model on what we think best practice might be for making these decisions. So we're co-creating a risk management framework with local authorities. We look to be finished with this perhaps early next year or sometime around April next year, where we will present it to the New Zealand Society of Earthquake Engineers in about April 2021. We'll present it to MB and Local Government New Zealand, and we'll put the paper out in April roughly and a number of journal publications also. So this is an example of where, we are looking to, well, for me personally, make social science practical and pragmatic, and let it to try to inform public policy decisions, if that makes sense. But most importantly, is trying to create a bridge between technical engineering advice and provide some guidance about how to take that and then make decisions that are not neglectful of social and economic impacts as well.